This is the story of the app Facebook couldn't afford to lose, and the man who spent the next decade trying to make them regret buying it. In 1997, a Ukrainian immigrant named John Combe was working as a security tester, sweeping floors on the side to help his family get by. He'd arrived in the U.S. 5 years earlier at 16, with his mother into a 2-bedroom apartment paid for partly by government assistance. That same year at Yahoo, he met a fellow engineer named Brian Acton. They had almost nothing in common on paper. Combe had grown up in a small apartment outside Kyiv with no running water. Acton was a Michigan-raised Stanford grad, one of Yahoo's first 44 employees, who'd already made and lost millions in the dot-com crash of 2000. What they shared was a low tolerance for corporate nonsense and 9 years working side by side. By 2007, they were burned out. They quit on Halloween and spent the next year backpacking across South America. No plan, no jobs waiting. When they came back, they both did something that in hindsight is almost too on the nose to believe. They applied for jobs at Facebook. Facebook turned them both down. In January 2009, Combe bought his first iPhone. The App Store was only 7 months old, and Combe had a hunch it was about to change everything. He wanted to build something simple, an app that just showed your status, busy, at the gym, phone dying, to the people who mattered. He talked it through with a friend, Alex Fishman, brought in a developer to build the front end, called it WhatsApp, a pun on What's Up, and incorporated the company on his 33rd birthday, February 24th, 2009. The first version was a disaster. It crashed constantly, drained batteries, and barely worked. Combe came close to shutting it down entirely. Then, in June 2009, Apple quietly added push notifications to the app stores, and everything changed. Suddenly, WhatsApp could ping you the instant a friend's status changed. Combe rebuilt the app around that one feature, relaunched it that September, and it started to catch on. By the fall, Combe needed help. He turned to Acton, still job hunting after the Facebook rejection, and persuaded him to come on board. Within a month, Acton convinced 5 former Yahoo colleagues to put in $250,000 between them. It was enough to keep the lights on, and enough to make Acton an official co-founder, with a stake that would end up worth more than either of them could have imagined. Here's the decision that made WhatsApp different from almost everything else being built in Silicon Valley at the time. Combe and Acton had both spent years at Yahoo watching ad banners pile up on every page, chasing revenue at the expense of the product. Acton described it later as a NASCAR approach, logos plastered everywhere, nothing else that mattered. They decided WhatsApp would never do that. No ads, no games, no gimmicks, just a small yearly fee charged after the first free year. It sounds almost naive by Silicon Valley standards, turn down the ad money that funds every other free app, but it worked exactly because users trusted it. No data harvesting, no tracking, no dark patterns, just a tool that did one thing extremely well. Growth was almost entirely word of mouth. 10,000 downloads a day when the app was free, and when they briefly experimented with charging up front, that number dropped to a trickle. So they slowed down on purpose, kept the infrastructure lean, and let the product speak for itself. To understand why WhatsApp mattered as much as it did, you have to remember what texting cost in 2009. In most of the world, SMS was priced per message, and international text could run you 20, 30, sometimes 50 cents each, a real expense for anyone messaging family abroad. WhatsApp used the same data connection you were already paying for and made unlimited messaging effectively free. For immigrant communities, for families split across borders, for anyone outside the US and Western Europe, that wasn't a nice to have. It was a completely different economics of staying in touch. WhatsApp wasn't alone in spotting this. Kik launched the same year, in 2009. Viber followed in 2010. Line came out of Japan in 2011. Every one of them was racing to solve the same problem. But WhatsApp had an 18-month head start, and on mobile, in a market driven entirely by network effects, an 18-month head start is close to insurmountable. The first messaging app your friends installed was the one that stuck, because a messaging app is only useful if the people you already talk to are on it too. By 2011, WhatsApp had cracked the top 20 apps in the United States, and it was growing even faster overseas, in India, Brazil, and across the Middle East, where it would eventually become the default way an entire generation communicated. That year, they took their first real outside money, $8 million from Sequoia Capital, led by partner Jim Goetz, but only after Sequoia agreed the app would stay ad-free. It was strange leverage for a 2-year-old startup to have. But Combe and Acton weren't in a hurry, and it showed. In April 2011, Mark Zuckerberg reached out to Cohn directly, by email. The two met for lunch at a small German bakery in Los Altos. Cohn showed Acton the email before he went. Acton's advice, go, but don't get your hopes up. They weren't shopping the company. For nearly 2 years, nothing happened. WhatsApp kept growing, hundreds of millions of users, almost no marketing spend, a tiny engineering team compared to its user base, still self-funded on a philosophy of doing more with less. Then, in early 2014, two things happened almost at once. Word got back to Zuckerberg that Cohn and Acton had been invited to Google's Mountain View campus for talks. An evaluation analysis from a Morgan Stanley banker, originally written for internal use, ended up in front of deal teams at both Facebook and Google. Facebook moved fast. The entire deal, the biggest internet acquisition of the decade, was negotiated and signed over a single Valentine's Day weekend, inside WhatsApp's own lawyer's office. There was so little time that, according to Acton, some details barely got discussed. One of the only things he insisted on in the room was simple: no ads in the product. On February 19, 2014, Facebook announced it was acquiring WhatsApp for approximately $19 billion in cash and stock, the most expensive acquisition in the company's history for an app that had barely any revenue at all. Cohn's roughly 45% stake alone was worth billions. Acton, who a few years earlier couldn't get hired at Facebook, walked away with a stake worth well over $3 billion. There's one detail from that day that's become part of tech folklore. As a teenager, Cohn's family had relied on food stamps, collected at a local welfare office in Mountain View. When it came time to sign the acquisition papers, Cohn chose to do it at that same building. Now, fittingly, the local headquarters of the social services office he'd once stood in line at. Here's where the story takes its strangest turn, and it starts 2 years after the acquisition, with a name most people have never heard, Moxie Marlinspike. Marlinspike was a coder and privacy researcher who'd spent years building encrypted communication tools, first through a startup called Whisper Systems, later through a nonprofit project called Open Whisper Systems. In 2014, his team released something called the Signal Protocol, an open-source encryption system considered by cryptographers to be one of the most secure ever built for consumer messaging. In 2016, WhatsApp made a decision that would look almost unbelievable in hindsight. Instead of building their own encryption from scratch, they partnered directly with Marlinspike's team and rolled the Signal Protocol out to every single WhatsApp user on Earth. Overnight, more than 1 billion conversations became end-to-end encrypted, using technology built by the same person who would soon become Brian Acton's closest ally, and whose nonprofit Acton would personally bankroll 2 years later. At the time, almost nobody clocked the irony. WhatsApp, the app Facebook had just spent $19 billion on, was now protected by the exact kind of privacy-first engineering philosophy that Facebook's entire ad business ran directly against. The two halves of the same story were already sitting inside one app, years before anyone would need to choose between them. For a while it worked. WhatsApp operated semi-independently inside Facebook, still ad-free, still small team, still Cohn as CEO. But the pressure to monetize a platform used by over 1 billion people doesn't go away just because the founders don't want it. Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg began pushing for ways to make WhatsApp pay for itself. Targeted ads, business messaging tools, and plans that Acton believed would require weakening the encryption he had just fought to build in. Acton pushed back. Repeatedly. In September 2017, he left the company, walking away from what has been reported as roughly $850 million in unvested stock rather than stay and watch the product change. Cohn held on a little longer, but in April 2018 he announced he was stepping down too, citing disagreements over how Facebook wanted to use WhatsApp's data. Neither departure made huge headlines at the time. That was about to change. In March 2018, the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke, the revelation that a political consulting firm had harvested the personal data of tens of millions of Facebook users without their consent and used it to build psychological profiles for targeted political advertising. It was, for many people outside the tech industry, the first time the abstract idea of your data felt like something that had actually been taken from them. A few weeks later, Brian Acton sent a single tweet. No explanation, no follow-up. Just 4 words. It is time. #delete Facebook. It went viral almost instantly. A co-founder who had personally made billions from Facebook, publicly telling the world to delete it. He hasn't posted on that account since. Acton didn't stop there. Later that year, he put $50 million of his own WhatsApp fortune into Marlinspike's nonprofit, co-founding the Signal Foundation and becoming its executive chairman. The mission was almost a mirror image of what WhatsApp had once promised and, in Acton's view, stopped delivering. Private messaging, no ads, no data harvesting, no ties to a company that profits from your attention. For 2 years, that was where the story seemed to end. Signal grew steadily, but slowly, a well-regarded app used mostly by journalists, activists, and security-conscious professionals. Nobody was under any illusion that it could compete with WhatsApp's 2 billion users. Then came January 2021. On January 4th, 2021, WhatsApp announced an update to its privacy policy, one that would require sharing certain account data with its parent company, Facebook, or face losing access to the app entirely. For a platform built on the explicit promise of privacy and no data sharing, it read, to a lot of longtime users, like exactly the betrayal Acton had warned about 3 years earlier. The backlash was immediate, and it had 2 unexpected boosters. Elon Musk tweeted 2 words to his tens of millions of followers: use Signal. Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor and one of the most recognizable privacy advocates alive, publicly endorsed it too. Signal's engineers, who'd built a small, careful nonprofit meant to serve a niche audience of the privacy conscious, were about to find out what happens when a niche audience becomes a mainstream stampede. Between January 7th and 8th, more than 100,000 people installed Signal in a single day. By the following week, installs on Google Play alone had jumped from roughly 10 million to more than 50 million, a 5-fold surge in under a week. The growth was so fast that Signal's own servers couldn't keep up. On January 15th, the app went down entirely, overwhelmed by the traffic of its own success. It took engineers a full day to bring it back online. Within 2 weeks, Signal had gone from a specialist tool used by a few million people to one of the most downloaded apps on Earth, funded almost entirely by the fortune Facebook had paid to acquire the very company whose users were now fleeing to it. Acton, speaking to TechCrunch that same month, called the growth exploding and admitted even he hadn't expected it to happen this fast, or for this reason. It's hard to overstate how strange this moment actually was. The same billion-dollar exit that should have ended Acton's involvement in messaging apps forever had instead financed the tool that years later would go head-to-head with his own creation and win a very public round. Strip away the dollar signs, and it's a strange kind of loop. Facebook rejected 2 engineers for entry-level jobs in 2007. Those same 2 engineers built something Facebook feared enough to pay $19 billion for in 2014. 2 years later, that acquired company was quietly running on encryption built by a man who would soon become the co-founder's closest ally. 4 years after the deal, one of the founders used his fortune to fund that same man's nonprofit. And 3 years after that, WhatsApp's own decisions handed that nonprofit its biggest single week of growth in its history. It's tempting to read this as a simple redemption story. It's really something a little more uncomfortable than that. Proof that the same values that make a founder walk away from ad money can also make him walk away from a company entirely, and that the tools he builds afterward can end up outliving or outperforming the thing that made him rich in the first place. Today, WhatsApp has grown past 3 billion users and remains technically still ad-free in the core app, the one clause Acton insisted on in that rushed Valentine's Day weekend still holding, more than a decade later. Signal, meanwhile, has become one of the most trusted encrypted messengers in the world, used by journalists, dissidents, government officials, and ordinary people who remember exactly why they downloaded it. Moxie Marlinspike stepped down as Signal's CEO in January 2022. Brian Acton remains executive chairman to this day.